The Sherman was already burning before anyone could place the shot. Somewhere in the hedgerows south of Saint-Lô, an American tank column had ground to a halt. The lead vehicle sat smoking in the narrow lane, flames licking from its engine deck, hatches thrown open. The crew that made it out were lying flat in the ditch. The crew that did not make it out would never leave. Nobody saw the shooter. Nobody heard the launch over the engine noise. One moment, the column was advancing through the green tunnel of a Norman lane. The next, a Sherman was on fire, and the radio was screaming. Then a second rocket struck the following tank in the side, then a third. Crews abandoned their vehicles and scrambled for the hedgerow banks, pressing themselves into the Normandy earth while their tanks cooked off behind them. American intelligence officers would later file their assessment of the weapon responsible. Clumsier than the bazooka, the report concluded. Reputed to be less accurate. Nothing to worry about. The men lying in those ditches knew better. The weapon that burned those Shermans began its life not in a German laboratory, but in the wreckage of an American defeat. February 1943, the Kasserine Pass in Tunisia. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's forces had just inflicted the worst American reverse of the North African campaign. Green American troops, many experiencing combat for the first time, broke under the assault of veteran Afrika Korps units. Over 3,000 soldiers were captured, along with mountains of equipment, vehicles, and weapons. Among the abandoned material, German intelligence officers found several examples of something most had never seen. A simple metal tube, open at both ends, with a crude wooden stock and basic iron sights. The American M1 Bazooka. It looked like something a plumber might have fabricated in his garage. General Eisenhower himself had learned the night before the North African landings that none of his troops had received any instruction in using their new rocket launchers. The weapon shipped with unreliable M6 rockets that often failed to detonate on impact, and American commanders visiting the Tunisian front could not find a single soldier willing to confirm the bazooka had actually stopped an enemy tank. It was an inauspicious beginning for a weapon that would change infantry warfare forever. The irony was bitter. America had created the world's first practical infantry anti-tank rocket launcher, then handed it to the enemy before its own soldiers had learned to use it properly. The captured examples were packed up and shipped to Germany with priority handling. They landed on the desks of the one group of engineers in the world best positioned to understand what they were looking at. Captured bazookas arrived at the Kummersdorf Proving Ground near Berlin within weeks. This was the Third Reich's premier weapons testing facility, the same grounds where German engineers were already testing the Faustpatron, the forerunner of the Panzerfaust. The timing was fortunate, because German anti-tank capabilities were approaching crisis. The standard anti-tank rifles that had served against early war tanks, the Panzerbuks 38 and 39, were now useless against Soviet T-34s and KV heavy tanks. Their 7.9 2mm rounds bounced harmlessly off the sloped armour Soviet designers had pioneered. Dedicated anti-tank gun crews were being killed faster than Germany could replace them. Something fundamentally new was needed. The demonstration at Kummersdorf in March 1943 changed the conversation. German ordnance officers watched a soldier fire the captured bazooka at a test plate. The weapon was light enough for one man to carry. It required no wheeled carriage, no crew of 5, no horses or vehicles to move it. A single infantryman could threaten a tank. The Heereswaffenamt, the Army Ordnance Office, recognized both the potential and the shortcomings. According to American Field Manual 23-30, the 60mm M6 rocket could penetrate approximately 76mm of armor plate at perpendicular impact. Against the frontal plate of a T-34, that was not enough. The battery-powered ignition system was unreliable in cold, failing precisely when Eastern Front troops needed it most. The weapon was a revelation in concept. In execution, it needed transformation. Development authority was given immediately to Hugo Schneider AG, known as HASAG, at their facility in Moselswitz. The question facing German engineers was whether to copy the American design or use it as the starting point for something more dangerous. They chose the second path. The decision that transformed the bazooka concept into a weapon Allied tankers would dread came down to a single number, 88. German ordnance was already manufacturing an 88mm shaped charge warhead for an existing weapon called the Raketenwerfer 43, nicknamed the Pupchin. The Pupchin worked effectively against Soviet armour, but it weighed over 140 kilograms with its wheeled carriage and required a crew to operate. Manhandling it across broken terrain under fire was nearly impossible. The Americans had proven a shoulder-fired tube could do the same job at a fraction of the weight and cost. Rather than engineer a new warhead from scratch, German designers adapted the existing 88mm munition already in production for the Pupchin. This seemingly simple choice, increasing the caliber from 60 to 88mm, dramatically multiplied the weapon's penetrating power. The physics made this scaling devastatingly effective. A shaped charge works by focusing explosive energy to collapse a copper cone into a high-velocity jet of metal. This jet, travelling at roughly 10 kilometers per second, penetrates armour through extreme localised pressure rather than heat or brute force. The larger the warhead, the more explosive material available, and the bigger the copper cone, the longer and more powerful the resulting jet. In German army tests, the 88mm warhead penetrated around 210 to 230mm of armour plate at perpendicular impact. Field conditions reduced this significantly. Practical combat penetration was closer to 160mm, accounting for oblique angles and the realities of firing under stress. Even that conservative figure was devastating against Allied armour. The M4 Sherman carried frontal armour of 51 to 76mm. The Soviet T-34 had 45 to 47mm on its glacis plate. At typical combat angles and ranges, these tanks were acutely vulnerable. The rocket motor required complete redesign. Engineers lengthened the motor housing from 490 to 650mm to accommodate improved propellant charges. The new rocket achieved a muzzle velocity of roughly 110 meters per second compared to the Bazooka's 80. Effective range increased to approximately 150 meters. The ignition system presented perhaps the most elegant solution to the American design's greatest weakness. Bazookas relied on batteries to generate the electrical current that fired the rocket. Batteries fail in cold. They corrode in humidity. They die without warning. On the Eastern Front, where winter temperatures routinely dropped below minus 30 degrees Celsius, battery reliability was not an inconvenience. It was a death sentence. German engineers replaced the entire electrical system with a spring-activated magneto called a Stoss generator, a mechanical device that produced current when the trigger was pulled. No batteries, no temperature limitations. The weapon would fire reliably whether the thermometer read plus 40 or minus 40. Ironically, the Americans later adopted this same magneto principle for their improved M9 bazooka, acknowledging that the German solution was simply better. One problem remained that engineering alone could not fully resolve. Unlike American rockets that burned out completely inside the launch tube, German rockets continued burning for roughly 2 meters after leaving the barrel. This produced a dangerous blast of flame and toxic exhaust directly behind the weapon, capable of seriously injuring anyone standing in the backblast area. The plume of smoke and fire also revealed the operator's position immediately, inviting return fire from tanks, machine guns, or infantry. A Panzer Shrek crew that fired and failed to relocate was a dead crew. Early operators were required to wear gas masks without filters to protect their faces, along with protective hoods and heavy gloves. In training, this was manageable. In combat, with a 30-ton tank grinding toward your position, fumbling with a gas mask was the difference between firing in time and dying. Reports from the Eastern Front made clear that crews were discarding the protective equipment and accepting the burns rather than risk the delay. The fix arrived in February 1944. A protective blast shield, a simple rectangle of sheet metal with a glass viewing window, was fitted forward of the operator's face. It solved the problem elegantly. No mask required, no hood, no delay. The operator could aim through the window and fire immediately. This configuration became the definitive Panzer Books 54. Frontline troops simply called it the Panzer Shrek, tank terror. German ordnance records, preserved in original documentation, reveal the remarkable speed of this development. July 1st, 1943. First documented mention in the official German equipment list as the 8.8cm Panzerbuchse 6030. September 30th, 1943. The first firing table manual printed and distributed. October 5th, 1943. First delivery to frontline units. 1,500 weapons and 5,000 rockets shipped by air transport for combat trials on the Eastern Front. November 29th, 1943. Hitler officially adopted the name Panzerschreck as part of a propaganda campaign that also renamed the assault rifle to Sturmgewehr. From captured bazooka to combat deployment in under 7 months. Production scaled rapidly to meet the insatiable demand from both fronts. Approximately 289,000 launchers were manufactured between late 1943 and the end of 1944. Over 2 million rockets were produced alongside them. The economics of this weapon were extraordinary. Each launcher cost 70 Reichsmarks. A Pak 36 anti-tank gun cost 5,730. A single Panzer IV medium tank cost over 100,000. For the price of one towed gun requiring a trained crew, towing vehicle, and ammunition supply chain, Germany could arm 82 infantrymen with weapons capable of killing a tank at close range. For the price of one tank, Germany could produce over 1,400 Panzerschreck launchers. In an attritional war where German industry was being systematically bombed and outproduced, these numbers mattered. Hassag at Moselwitz led production, but the program expanded across German industry as demand outstripped capacity. The Dassler brothers' shoe factory in Herzogenaurach converted to Panzerschreck manufacture in late 1943. The same family would later split into 2 rival sporting goods companies, one of which became Adidas. By mid-1944, 7 major manufacturing centres operated alongside dozens of subcontractors producing individual components. Speed came at a cost. German documents were frank about the compromises. The Panzerschreck is a Kriegskind, a child of war, one manual acknowledged. The development had to be done very fast. Certain shortcomings are the price to pay. Early production models suffered from missing safety brackets, rocket loading difficulties, and fragile sight frames that bent during transport. Field upgrade kits were distributed to correct problems while the weapons were already in service. The Germans were building and fixing at the same time, learning from combat reports and implementing corrections on the production line in real time. If you are finding this documentary interesting, subscribing helps more than you know. It takes a moment and it means we can keep making content like this. Now let us examine what happened when these weapons met Allied tanks in combat. An American intelligence report from October 1944 described the Panzerschreck as clumsier than the Bazooka and reputed to be less accurate. Newspapers back home carried headlines designed to reassure anxious families. Dramatic German weapons proving not too effective. This was propaganda for civilian consumption. It bore no resemblance to what was happening in the hedgerows. The first serious encounters came during the Italian campaign in late 1943, where German infantry used the weapon against Sherman struggling up mountain roads. But Normandy transformed the Panzerschreck from a tactical nuisance into a strategic nightmare. The bocage country of northern France consists of small agricultural fields bordered by ancient hedgerows, thick earthen banks topped with centuries of tangled root and branch. Some of these hedgerows dated to the Roman occupation, their bases packed with soil and stone into walls that could stop a bullet. Visibility rarely exceeded 50 metres. Roads ran through tunnels of vegetation, where ambushes could be prepared and escape routes guaranteed in every direction. A tank column moving through bocage was blind, slow, and channeled into predictable routes. For the crew of a Sherman, every hedge could conceal a killer. For a German tank hunting team with a Panzerschreck, this was perfect terrain. German tactics exploited every advantage. Crews of 2 or 3 men positioned themselves in the hedgerows, sometimes allowing an entire American column to pass before firing into the rear of the last vehicle. The rear of a Sherman housed the engine and fuel tanks behind thin armour plates. One hit there meant fire. The shaped charge jet, a stream of copper travelling at roughly 10 kilometers per second, would punch through the thin rear plate and ignite fuel or detonate stored ammunition. The German crew would fire, relocate through the hedgerow maze, and vanish before American infantry could close in. For the men inside the tanks, the experience was uniquely terrifying. A Panzerschreck gave almost no warning. There was no muzzle flash visible through the narrow vision blocks. The rocket's flight time across 50 meters was less than half a second. The first indication of attack was the impact itself, a deafening crash followed by a jet of superheated metal and fragments spraying through the crew compartment. Survivors described a sudden flash of light, intense heat, and the smell of burning paint and flesh. Those who could still move had seconds to evacuate before ammunition began cooking off. Stanley Sislowski of the Perth Regiment, 5th Canadian Armoured Division, experienced these attacks firsthand. He recalled paratroopers firing on the lead tanks with their extremely effective Panzerfausts and Panzerschrecks, both much feared by our tank crews, he wrote. The aftermath he witnessed left no doubt about what these weapons could do to a tank and its occupants. The statistics confirmed what the men on the ground already knew. American tank losses to handheld anti-tank weapons rose from 4% in September 1944 to 12.5% in October and 14.5% in November. During the final advance into Germany, when depleted German armoured formations could no longer contest Allied tanks directly, the figure climbed to between 25 and 35%. An American Operations Research Office study later examined 12,140 knocked-out Allied tanks across all theatres. Anti-tank rockets accounted for 7.5% of total losses, rising to 10% from mid-1944 onward. In the war's final months, handheld rockets surpassed mines and artillery to become one of the leading causes of Allied armour destruction. Corporal Donald E. Lewis participated in comparative penetration tests, firing both American and German weapons against a captured Panther tank. His assessment was blunt. The Panzerschreck was far superior to the American Bazooka. Not a propaganda claim. An American soldier's plain observation after putting rounds into armoured steel with both weapons. The Eastern Front provided the proving ground where infantry anti-tank weapons were tested against the largest armoured forces in history. By 1944, the Red Army possessed tank superiority that Germany could never match. T-34 production alone exceeded 30,000 units per year. German panzer divisions were being ground to nothing through attrition. Infantry anti-tank weapons became not a supplement to armoured warfare, but increasingly its replacement. A Panzerschreck crew could be trained in days. A Panzer crew took months. The economics of attrition favoured the cheaper weapon. The Battle of Berlin in April and May 1945 brought these weapons into the conditions where they were most dangerous. Urban combat at close quarters. Tank hunting teams positioned themselves in cellar windows, behind rubble, in the burnt-out shells of apartment blocks. Soviet armoured columns pushing through narrow streets found themselves in close range, killing zones with no room to manoeuvre and no ability to depress their main guns low enough to engage threats at basement level. The streets of Berlin became a particular nightmare for Soviet tank commanders. T-34s attempting to push down main boulevards presented their flanks to windows on both sides simultaneously. IS-2 heavy tanks, despite their formidable armour, could not elevate or depress their guns sufficiently to engage enemies in upper-story windows or cellar openings. Self-propelled guns designed for open battlefield engagement were helpless in urban canyons where the enemy could fire from above, below, or from any of dozens of windows along a single block. Soviet operational reports document the scale of the problem with precision rather than propaganda. Commander Bogdanov's report on the 2nd Guards Tank Army, a formation noted for taking particularly heavy losses from Panzerfaust fire during the Berlin fighting, recorded 576 vehicles disabled. Of those, 106, roughly 18%, were attributed to Panzerfaust hits. Other Soviet formations operating in less confined terrain reported even lower figures, between 3 and 6%. Popular histories often claim that 70% of Soviet tank losses in Berlin came from infantry weapons. Soviet archives tell a different story. The threat was real and frightening, but it was not the overwhelming dominance that legend suggests. What the documents do confirm is that the danger was serious enough to reshape Soviet tactics entirely. Infantry platoons were assigned to protect each tank company from close-range ambush. T-34s learned to hug building walls, denying flanking shots through windows. Artillery commanders used heavy howitzers at point-blank range to demolish entire buildings suspected of harbouring tank hunters. These countermeasures worked, but they were costly and slow, turning a campaign that Soviet planners expected to last days into weeks of grinding urban warfare. The best documented Panzerschreck success came not in Berlin but in Finland. The Battle of Tali-Ihantala, fought between June 25th and July 9th, 1944, was the largest battle in Nordic history. Finnish forces, outnumbered 3-1, faced a massive Soviet offensive that committed nearly 500,000 troops, over 6,000 artillery pieces, and hundreds of tanks. The objective was to break the Finnish defensive lines on the Karelian Isthmus and knock Finland out of the war entirely. Finland's survival as an independent nation hung on the outcome. Germany had shipped 1,854 launchers and 18,650 rockets to Finland earlier that year. The Finns designated the weapon Panzerschreck, their own translation of tank terror. In a single afternoon during the height of the fighting, Finnish troops using Panzerschrecks destroyed 25 Soviet tanks. Sergeant Paul Renville personally knocked out 4 heavy assault vehicles, earning near-legendary status among Finnish defenders. The Soviet offensive stalled against Finnish lines that held through 10 days of relentless assault. Finland negotiated an armistice that preserved its independence, the only European nation bordering the Soviet Union to avoid occupation after the war. Allied tank crews did not accept destruction passively. They improvised with whatever materials they could scavenge, welding anything available to their vehicles in hopes of triggering shaped charge warheads prematurely before the penetrating jet could form properly. The theory behind these field modifications was sound in principle. A shaped charge requires a specific standoff distance between the warhead and the armour surface to achieve maximum penetration. Detonate the warhead too early, before the jet has fully formed, and its penetrating power decreases. Anything that could trigger premature detonation, even a few centimetres of additional material, might make the difference between a penetration and a deflection. The 12th and 14th Armoured Divisions piled sandbags onto their Shermans. Up to 170 bags on a single vehicle, layered 2 to 4 deep on fronts and 2 deep on sides. The weight was staggering. Tank suspensions groaned under loads they were never designed to carry, transmissions strained, fuel consumption climbed, engines overheated on inclines. But tankers reasoned that a slow tank was better than a burning one. Testing on March 9, 1945, by the 1st Armoured Group produced discouraging results. Panzerfaust rounds penetrated sandbagged side armour regardless. Some angled frontal hits were defeated, but the protection was inconsistent. General Patton banned sandbags in the Third Army, entirely after ordnance officers reported they were largely useless, and the additional weight was wrecking tank drivetrains. The 4th Armoured Division tried welding captured Panther frontal plates onto their Shermans. Other units experimented with spare track links, logs, corrugated metal screens on wooden standoffs, and layers of concrete 3 to 4 inches thick. None proved consistently effective against a determined attacker with a Panzerschreck. British trials at Shoeburyness in autumn 1944 tested mesh screens designed to trigger premature detonation. 3 of 4 Panzerfaust 30 rounds failed to detonate properly against the screens. Encouraging. Then they tested the more powerful Panzerfaust 60. It punched through. The larger warhead simply carried too much penetrating energy for improvised standoff armour to defeat reliably. Canadian Armoured Forces intelligence reached a sobering conclusion. Alert infantry support remained the best defence. The answer to the Panzerschreck was not better armour. It was killing the man holding the weapon before he could fire. This required infantry to advance alongside every tank, clearing each hedgerow, each building, each pile of rubble. Tanks could no longer roam ahead of their supporting infantry. The 70 Reichsmark weapon had imposed a cost on Allied combined arms operations that dwarfed its manufacturing price. The most telling acknowledgement of the Panzerschreck's effectiveness came from the same American ordnance establishment that had dismissed the weapon as clumsier and less accurate. In late 1944, after persistent field reports that the 60mm bazooka was inadequate against German armour, particularly against the frontal plates of Panthers and Tigers, the US Ordnance Corps began developing a replacement. Engineers examined captured Panzerschrecks in detail. They studied the German magneto-ignition, the larger caliber warhead, the improved rocket motor. Then they built the M20 Super Bazooka with a caliber of 3.5 inches, 89mm, nearly identical to the Panzerschreck's 88. The Americans had invented the shoulder-fired anti-tank rocket. The Germans had demonstrated that bigger was better. Now American ordnance acknowledged reality and followed the same path the Germans had blazed. The M20 achieved 280mm of penetration while weighing only 6.5 kilograms, considerably lighter than the German weapon thanks to aluminium construction that wartime Germany could never have matched. It entered combat in Korea in July 1950, rushed to the front after the old bazookas proved unable to stop North Korean T-34-85s rolling south. The Super Bazooka changed the equation overnight. Tanks that had been invulnerable to American infantry weapons in June were burning in July. The German lesson had taken 5 years to learn, but it was learned completely. The Soviets drew their own conclusions from captured German anti-tank weapons. Panzerfausts and Panzerschrecks were extensively tested, beginning in 1944, alongside American bazookas obtained through Lend-Lease. Soviet documents referred to the weapons simply as Faust and Offenrohr, stovepipe, never bothering with proper German designations. Red Army units were less concerned with naming conventions than with deploying captured examples against their former owners. The post-war RPG-1 and subsequent RPG-2 combined the Panzerfaust's disposable simplicity with the Panzerschreck's reloadable shoulder-fired format. The lineage runs directly from German wartime engineering through Soviet manufacturing philosophy into the RPG-7, the weapon that has defined infantry anti-armor combat on every continent, from Vietnam to Afghanistan to Ukraine. Every guerrilla force, every insurgent movement, every army that cannot afford tanks has reached for some descendant of the principle German engineers proved in 1943. A man with a tube can kill a tank. The Panzerschreck started as a copy. There is no disputing that. German engineers took an American invention, stripped it down, and asked what would happen if they made the warhead bigger, the ignition more reliable, the rocket faster. What emerged outperformed the original so dramatically that the Americans were forced to redesign their own weapon from scratch after the war, scaling it up to the very caliber the Germans had chosen 2 years earlier. Cheap did not mean inferior, it meant efficient. A weapon costing less than an infantry rifle could destroy a vehicle worth more than a house. That Sherman crew in the hedgerows outside St-Lô never identified the weapon that hit them. The German soldier who fired it had waited since dawn, invisible among the vegetation, his loader crouched beside him with a second rocket ready. His weapon weighed barely 11 kilograms loaded. His target weighed 30 tons. The mathematics of that exchange favoured the man in the hedgerow every single time. After the war, the men who had dismissed the Panzerschreck as a cheap copy learned what it could do. The intelligence officers who had filed reassuring reports were contradicted by the men who had actually faced the weapon. The soldiers who survived its ambushes carried those memories for decades, speaking of hedgerows and burning tanks in the same quiet tones they used for all the things that still woke them at night. The tankers who burned inside their Shermans carried nothing at all. The Panzerschreck did not win the war for Germany. Nothing could have by 1944. The industrial resources of the Allied powers were simply too vast to overcome, and no infantry weapon could reverse the strategic reality of a war fought on 3 fronts against enemies who outproduced Germany in every category. But the Panzerschreck proved something that changed warfare permanently. A single infantryman, properly armed with a 70 Reichsmark weapon, could destroy the most powerful armoured vehicles on Earth. It proved that industrial killing worked both ways, and that the advantage did not always belong to the side with the bigger machines. That is the story of the Panzerschreck. The Weapon G is called a cheap copy, the weapon that proved them wrong.